Have you ever walked into a room, said hello, and their eyes told you you don't belong here? It's in the cold stare, the forced smile, the harmless-sounding words that somehow make you feel small in a room full of bright lights. You try to stay calm, to be polite, but deep inside, something cracks. And the same question you've carried for years comes back, louder than ever. When will we finally be seen for our true worth? That morning, in the grand lobby of Summit Financial, a black man stood among the rows of waiting clients. Dr. Elijah Carter, a modest suit, polished shoes, a thick portfolio in hand, arrived right on time for his meeting with the bank's investment board. But instead of a handshake, he got a scowl. Gregory Hales, the branch manager, looked him over and sneered. People like you always think you're more important than you are. Then, with deliberate contempt, Hales knocked the portfolio out of Carter's hands. Papers scattered across the marble floor. Security moved in. And the people in that lobby, they didn't see a billion-dollar partner. They saw a problem. Elijah Carter bent down, slowly picking up each page. No excuses, no arguments. Just a quiet pause. Then he took out his phone and typed a short message. Plan B, now. They had no idea. The man they'd just humiliated didn't come here to open an account. He came here to buy the entire system. Weeks later, Elijah Carter returned to Summit. But he wasn't the suspicious guest anymore. He walked into the boardroom as the owner of nearly 1/4 of the bank, bringing with him a plan. A plan not just to reclaim his dignity, but to change how this bank treats an entire community. If you've ever been judged by your appearance, like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because what happens next, you won't want to miss. That morning, the flagship branch of Summit Financial buzzed like a disturbed beehive. White fluorescent light bounced off polished marble, turning the bank's grand lobby into a dazzling yet sterile stage. The click of heels, the hush of client whispers, the steady rhythm of employees calling out names. It all blended into a chaotic symphony of finance. And in the middle of it, a man stopped at the reception line. Dr. Elijah Carter. His stride was firm, yet calm, every movement deliberate. A tailored gray suit, a muted blue tie, shoes so polished they mirrored the light above. No flashy watch, no designer logos, nothing to hint at his true position. He dressed just well enough not to be dismissed, but modestly enough to blend into the crowd. In his hand, a worn leather briefcase. Inside, the proposal for a $1.1 billion investment into Summit's digital banking division. An amount big enough to save them from the hungry hands of outside acquisitions. But to anyone watching, Elijah was just another black man walking into a bank during peak hours, a shadow among shadows. He scanned the room. An older woman clutched a folder full of handwritten notes. A young couple checked their account balances on their phones. At the front desk, Marisol Vega, a new receptionist, scrambled to juggle multiple requests. Elijah took a deep breath and approached. Voice steady. I have an appointment with the investment board, 9:30. Marisol quickly checked her screen. A slight frown creased her face. I don't see your name here, sir. Elijah smiled patiently. Perhaps it's under the company name, Carter Innovations. Could you check again? Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the lobby. What's going on here? Gregory Hales, Hales. Branch manager. Big frame, bigger ego. He strode forward with the swagger of a man who believed his space and everyone in it belonged to him. His eyes swept Elijah up and down. Not curious, not assessing, but judging the way men like him think they can understand someone's worth in a single glance. Elijah knew that look. He'd seen it in medical school lecture halls, in corporate boardrooms, in places where power always seemed to come with a certain skin tone. He kept his faint smile. Gregory Hales. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Marisol bit her lip, scrambling for an explanation. But Hales moved in like a man about to catch an imposter. "People like you," he said, his voice dripping disdain, "always think you're more important than you are." Before Elijah could reply, Hales yanked the portfolio from his hands and with a deliberate flick, sent the documents spilling across the marble floor. Business plans, financial reports, investor letters, scattered like worthless scraps. The dry slap of paper hitting the ground silenced the lobby. Marisol gasped softly. She bent down to help, but Hales waved her off. "Leave it. We need to verify what he's really here for." A security guard stepped closer. His eyes scanned Elijah from shoes to tie, as if looking for an excuse to remove him. Around them, everything stopped. Customers stared. Some exchanged pitying looks. Most stayed quiet. An older woman subtly pulled her son away from the scene. That quiet, collective judgment filled the air like a verdict Elijah had heard all his life. "You don't belong here." He crouched down, slowly collecting his papers. One sheet at a time. Smoothing each edge as if preserving not just his documents, but his dignity. "I told you," Elijah said, his voice calm and deep. "I have an appointment." Hales didn't even look at him. "You people say that all the time, but we have no record of it. If you can't prove it, I'll have to ask you to leave." Elijah rose, locking eyes with Hales. No anger. No pleading. Just quiet fire. He said nothing. Instead, he brushed the dust from his suit, reached into his pocket, and typed a short message. Plan B, now. No one knew who he texted. No one realized that in that moment of public humiliation, the entire game had just shifted. Hales folded his arms, satisfied like a man who believed he'd put someone in their place. "Hold him here," he ordered the guard. "I need further verification." Elijah let him feel powerful. For now. Because men like Hales rarely see it coming when the ground beneath them starts to crack. When a man like Elijah Carter chooses silence, it isn't surrender. It's the beginning of the counterattack. He carefully placed the last page into his briefcase. No sighs, no explanations. Just deliberate, measured movements. Gregory Hales loomed over him, smug. "You should know this is a professional institution," he said sharply. "Not a place for people to just show up claiming to be important." Elijah gave a slight nod, as if agreeing. But inside, he almost laughed. If Hales knew why he was there, he'd roll out a red carpet and personally escort him to the top floor. But perhaps letting them stay blind for a little while longer would make what came next more satisfying. Elijah sent the text again. Plan B, now. It wasn't just an order. It was the first move in a game of chess he'd been setting up for months. Because Elijah Carter never walked into any meeting without a contingency. In a world where doors don't open for men like him, he doesn't knock. He buys the entire building. Gregory Hales kept talking, puffed up like a small king in his marble castle. "You'll have to wait like everyone else, and if you can't prove you belong here..." He let the threat hang. The security guard shifted closer, hand on his radio. Elijah locked his briefcase. He glanced around the lobby. Strangers stared. Some with pity. Some with barely concealed amusement. He knew this feeling too well. But being tired of it didn't mean giving in to it. He took one deep breath. Then turned toward the exit. Not retreating, but leaving on his own terms. Gregory Hales watched him go, certain he'd just put a nobody in his place. He didn't know that the man walking out calm, quiet, unshaken, had just set in motion a chain of events that would shake his entire world. Elijah Carter didn't lose anything that morning. But Summit Financial. They were about to lose everything. Morning light spilled through the towering glass wall of a 42-story building, stretching across a polished walnut desk. Dr. Elijah Carter walked in, slowly removing his coat to reveal a crisp, tailored white shirt. He hung the coat neatly, adjusted his cuffs, and paused for a moment as if shedding the invisible dust of what had happened earlier that morning. The bank lobby, the clicking shoes, the condescending glances, the scattered papers, all of it was folded into one long exhale. This office mirrored the man himself, refined but never boastful. Harvard and Mayo Clinic plaques hung straight on the wall, modestly framed, yet impossible to ignore. Bookshelves held stacks of medical research reports, beside a small display of photos from his charity surgeries in Africa and Southeast Asia. These weren't decorations. They told the story of a man who used his mind to save lives and his success to create opportunities for others. On his desk lay a thick binder and an open laptop. The screen showed Carter Innovations' massive growth charts, the investment firm he founded, managing billions, much of it funneled into medical technology and education. These weren't just numbers. They were proof of a journey from a boy who grew up in a poor neighborhood, to a top neurosurgeon, to a strategist powerful enough that major corporations couldn't ignore him. Elijah sat back in his chair, hand resting on his chin, gazing at Chicago's winter skyline towers rising out of a blanket of fog. No one in that bank lobby knew that the man they dismissed this morning was the very reason Summit Financial still had a future. If this investment went through, the bank would survive. If not, it might not live through the next few quarters. A soft knock on the door. Yvonne Price, his financial advisor, entered with a coffee in hand and worry in her eyes. "Elijah," she said, "we still have time to choose another bank. There are plenty of places that know how to treat their clients." Elijah gave a faint smile, sipping his coffee. "Yvonne, I didn't build an investment firm to take the easy roads. I didn't go to Summit to ask for a seat." He leaned back, voice steady as steel. "I went there to buy them." It wasn't arrogance. It was the cold certainty of a man who understood exactly where he stood. He glanced at the rows of banks outside the window. Gregory Hales might think he was the gatekeeper. But soon, he would learn Elijah Carter owned the keys. Yvonne hesitated, waiting for him to reconsider. "You're not angry," she asked, "after how they treated you this morning?" Her voice cracked with both frustration and helplessness. Elijah turned to her, his eyes clear, unclouded by emotion. "I don't waste energy being angry at people who don't understand who I am," he said. "I use that energy to work." Andre Boone, his attorney, entered with a folder under his arm, his smile edged with a knowing sharpness. "Summit thinks they're dealing with a client who needs them," Andre said. "They don't know they're the ones who need us." Elijah took the folder, flipping through. Inside, a detailed report on Summit's fragile financials mounting bad debt, rising acquisition rumors, whispers on the street that they were vulnerable. He tapped his fingers on the desk in thought. "We move forward," he said calmly, "but not the way they expect. They think they're guarding the door. I'm buying the whole house." Yvonne raised a brow. "You're still investing in a bank that openly humiliated you." Elijah's lips curved in a faint, dry smile. "They publicly humiliated a man, but privately they're begging an investor to save them." He paused. "That contradiction is my leverage." The room fell silent. Elijah stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the streets below. "I've lived this my whole life, Yvonne," he said quietly. "In classrooms, in boardrooms, anywhere power had a color I didn't belong to." He turned back, his voice sharper now. "Their condescension is nothing new, but today they disrespected the wrong man." Andre chuckled. Phase 2 begins, he said. Set the trap. They won't even see it coming. Elijah touched the Harvard plaque on his wall, almost absent-mindedly. When they underestimate me, he said, they hand me the greatest advantage. The most underestimated man in the room is always the most dangerous. He picked up the phone. Get the strategy team. 30 minutes. We have work to do. Andre closed the folder, his grin widening. Summit won't even know what hit them until it's over. Elijah returned to his chair. They think I came to beg for a seat at their table, he said. He looked at Andre and Yvonne, his voice low but firm. But I came to own the table. From his briefcase, Elijah pulled out a prepared playbook weeks in the making. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a plan step by step, precise, built to leave Summit Financial blind until it was far too late. He skimmed each section, stopping at the most crucial. Authorization to acquire shares through shell corporations. We split the transactions, Elijah instructed, his tone calm but razor-sharp. No single deal triggers disclosure requirements. They'll just see a few random names buying stock. No one will connect the dots until it's too late. Andre smirked. A man thrown out of their lobby, becoming their largest shareholder, that's poetic. Elijah didn't answer. He simply signed. The stroke of his pen closed one chapter and opened another. Yvonne leaned forward, concern still etched across her face. Elijah, if they catch on early, they can block the acquisition. You're gambling big. Elijah looked up, that thin, calculated smile returning. Yvonne, I don't play small games. And this isn't just a deal. He leaned back, his words dropping like lead. This is a reminder. Power doesn't live in a bank lobby. It lives in the hands of those who stay quiet and act when the time is right. He closed the playbook and slid it to Andre. Start now. I want it in motion before their board meets next week. Andre nodded and began making calls. Yvonne exhaled, shaking her head with a faint smile. Sometimes I forget, Elijah, she said softly. You're not just a surgeon. You're a strategist who knows how to use his mind like a weapon. Elijah stepped back to the window. Below, Chicago's streets curved like the lines of a chessboard. He thought of Gregory Hales and that look of contempt. In this game, Hales was nothing more than a pawn. A pawn confidently marching forward, not knowing he was walking into a trap. Elijah Carter signed the final page with a steady hand. The man humiliated in Summit's lobby that morning had just made his opening move. And this was only the beginning of the game that would end with checkmate. Chicago at night had a strange kind of beauty. Glass towers reflected the city lights like an enormous chessboard, each glowing square a story, a move in a larger game of power. Dr. Elijah Carter sat in a high-rise conference room. Not as a doctor, not as the humiliated man from the bank lobby, but as a strategist, calculating the takeover of a financial empire. On the wall-sized screen before him, numbers flashed non-stop. Summit Financial stock prices, daily trading volumes, a list of entities buying shares. At the bottom of the screen, a note glowed. Aggregated from 7 legal entities. None of them could be traced back to Elijah. Each one was a shell, a piece of the puzzle he and Andre Boone built to hide the full picture. We keep every deal under 3%, Elijah said, his voice low and steady. No reason for them to disclose anything. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be over. Andre, standing by the screen, added, Summit will just see random investment funds picking up shares. They'll whisper about a takeover, but they'll have no idea who's holding the strings. Elijah's eyes stayed locked on the chart, the colored lines shifting with every purchase. They weren't just data points. They were the heartbeat of a beast. And he was slowly taking control of it. At the far end of the table, Yvonne Price flipped through market reports. "Trading volume's up 12% today," she said. "Some analysts are starting to notice." Elijah's lips curved slightly. "Let them notice," he said, "but let them guess wrong. While they're busy debating who's trying to swallow Summit, we'll already own it." He thought back to that morning. The way Gregory Hales looked at him in the bank lobby. Like a nuisance, like a man out of place. There was a bitter irony in it. That same man, if he knew Elijah was quietly buying his bank piece by piece, would change his tone in an instant. Elijah rose and walked to a glass board covered in strategy notes. Every line written there was a move. A way to turn humiliation into leverage. This wasn't about being insulted anymore. This was about taking control. He turned to his team, his voice sharp as a blade. "Keep buying. Tonight, we take another step. By the time they wake up, Summit won't belong to them anymore." Somewhere in those glowing Summit office towers, executives were sleeping peacefully, unaware their power was being drained piece by piece. But Elijah knew buying stock wasn't enough. Numbers could win battles. But to change a system, he needed the truth. The kind that couldn't be buried under standard procedures and PR statements. He hired Ramirez Investigations, the firm corporations call when they want the kind of truth no one dares to print. "I need real data," Elijah told them at their first meeting, "not just anecdotes. I want a picture so clear they'll see themselves in every number." In the weeks that followed, Ramirez's undercover mystery clients spread across Summit branches. A white man, casually dressed, depositing a check served in 8 minutes. A black woman with the same transaction waiting 32 minutes before anyone noticed her. An Asian client applying for an account asked for extra documentation that wasn't required. Meanwhile, a traditional customer signing the same forms. Approved in minutes. Reports poured into Elijah's office. Audio recordings, surveillance snapshots, detailed accounts of each interaction. With every file, his eyes darkened. This wasn't a few bad incidents. This was a pattern discrimination dressed up as procedure. Yvonne exhaled, scanning the numbers. "We're not just buying a bank, Elijah," she said quietly. "We're exposing it." Elijah didn't look up. "They think this behavior only hurts the powerless," he replied. "They don't realize it's handing me a weapon far more powerful than my shares." Andre leaned against the wall, smirking. "We'll turn their rotten culture into the very evidence that forces them to kneel." Elijah closed the file, drumming his fingers lightly, keeping time with a song only he could hear. He wasn't preparing for a shareholder meeting. He was preparing for a confrontation. A reckoning where every denial they tried to make would be obliterated by the evidence in his hands. When these reports hit the table, Summit wouldn't just be facing an investor. They'd be facing a man holding the truth that could shake their empire. Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The numbers flickered. Shares acquired. Average wait times by race. Field notes from the investigation team. Each figure pierced Summit's carefully crafted image of being fair, welcoming, and open for all. He chuckled softly, a dry, knowing laugh. They really thought they could hide this forever. Andre spun a pen between his fingers, catching the edge in Elijah's tone. "Let me guess," he said. "You're not handing this to regulators, not yet. You're keeping it as a card to play." Elijah nodded. "A weapon is most valuable when they don't know it exists. Let them keep believing I'm just that nobody from the lobby. Let Gregory Hales and people like him keep sleeping on their arrogance." Yvonne set down her coffee, meeting his gaze through her glasses. "You're not worried they'll uncover this, the shell companies. The investigation one slip, and they'll catch on." Elijah tilted his head, smiling faintly. "Yvonne, people like them only focus on what they can see. A quiet man in their lobby, not worth noticing." A handful of small firms buying shares. Nothing serious. A few customer complaints, minor inconveniences. They'll convince themselves everything's under control until it isn't. Andre laughed. Nothing sweeter than watching someone who underestimated you drop to their knees, only to realize you've been standing over them all along. Elijah walked to the window. Chicago's night stretched below him, a city lit like a chessboard, every piece waiting to be moved. He placed a hand on the glass. Real power, he said slowly, is letting people believe they're in control, while every step they take is already in your hands. He turned back to his team, that faint smile still there. The more they underestimated him, the harder the strike would land. And Summit Financial. They had no idea they were sitting on a bomb. One he'd already set to go off. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet side street, where the noise of Chicago seemed to stop at its weathered wooden door. The smell of freshly roasted coffee mingled with warm waffles, creating a rare kind of peace, the kind Elijah Carter and Marisol Vega both desperately needed. Marisol sat in the far corner, her back to the door. Her hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, but loose strands framed her face, the kind of detail that revealed she hadn't slept. When Elijah entered, she jumped to her feet, then quickly sat back down, like her confidence was only a fragile mask. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Elijah said, his deep, steady voice carrying an ease meant to loosen the tension gripping the young woman's shoulders. Marisol pulled a USB drive from her purse, her hand trembling so much Elijah reached out to steady it. "Everything is in here," she whispered. 7 racial discrimination complaints, buried. They paid off the victims, made them sign NDAs, then locked the files away in cabinets no one ever opens. But that's not all. Elijah stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on her face. "Go on," he said. Marisol swallowed hard. "I also took the promotion files that were blocked, every single one of them. Employees of color. Their records were stellar. They met every requirement. But Gregory Hales labeled them as not a good cultural fit, and you know exactly what cultural fit means here." A heavy silence filled the air. Elijah's fingers brushed over the USB, feeling its weight heavier than any megabytes it contained. "Do you understand what you're risking?" he asked. "I do." She lifted her head. And in those nervous eyes a spark of resolve burned through. "But I can't keep sitting there, watching this happen. I joined Summit because I believed things would be different. I was wrong." Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. In her, he saw himself years ago. A person who once believed the system's promises, only to learn those promises were built on invisible walls. He didn't say anything hollow like, "You did the right thing." Instead, he simply nodded. "I won't let them touch you." Marisol managed a faint smile. Not relief, but the kind of smile of someone who knew the road ahead would be rough yet finally understood she wouldn't have to walk it alone. Elijah slipped the USB into his jacket pocket, knowing he had just been handed a critical piece of the board. Gregory Hales may have thought his secrets were buried. But he had no idea they were about to be dug up and dragged into the light in ways he could never imagine. "Why risk it?" Elijah asked, not out of suspicion, but out of genuine care. Marisol clasped her hands together, knuckles whitening against the wooden table. "My grandmother went to Summit in 1983, she began, each word sounding like it was pulled from an old wound. She wanted a loan to buy a small house for our family. She had a steady job, great credit history. But they told her, 'You don't meet our criteria.' My mother went in 2001. Different dream, she wanted to expand her grocery store. Same answer." Her voice wavered, but her eyes lit with a fire that was part pride, part heartbreak. "When I got hired, I thought things had changed. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could help change the culture from the inside. But nothing changed. They just got better at hiding it. Elijah said nothing. He had heard hundreds, maybe thousands of stories like this over the years. From patients. From colleagues. From people begging for funding for their community projects. But there was something different about hearing it from an insider, someone who had watched the injustice from both sides of the counter. "Marisol," he said quietly, "you don't have to carry this alone. But once we start, there's no turning back. Summit will fight to keep this buried. And they won't hesitate to come after anyone who stands with me. You think I don't know that?" Her lips curved into a half-smile, bitter, defiant. "I've seen how they remove troublemakers. I've watched brave co-workers speak up, only to disappear into the HR void. But I also know this staying silent has never saved anyone." Elijah studied her. In this young woman, he saw something he deeply believed in: the quiet, unshakable strength of ordinary people willing to fight extraordinary injustices. He sipped his coffee, sealing the decision already forming in his mind. "All right," he said finally, his gaze locked on her. "We won't just expose what they've done. We'll force them to change." Marisol looked at him, her expression softening. In that moment, she found an ally she hadn't dared hope for. Elijah buttoned his coat and slipped the USB into his inner pocket. Gregory Hales thought his payoffs and silenced files had buried the truth. But what Marisol had just handed Elijah wasn't just evidence. It was a detonator. And Elijah Carter's hand was now on the switch. He rolled the USB between his fingers, the cold metal seeping into his skin. Small? Insignificant to anyone else. But heavy enough to rattle an entire bank. He set it on the table not as a trinket, but as a chess piece. A piece now in play. "Marisol," he said, voice calm as but firm. "What you've given me isn't just proof. It's a portrait of Summit's true culture. The culture they market as professional and diverse, but that rots behind closed doors." She nodded, staring down at her cold coffee. "They brag about community programs, scholarships, diverse hiring. But we both know it's just paint on a cracked wall. You saw my reports, people good enough to lead, trapped in the same positions because they don't look like the rest." Elijah's jaw tightened. He'd faced men with far more power than Gregory Hales, negotiated with corporations more ruthless than Summit. But what disgusted him most here wasn't just the racism. It was the smugness. The arrogance of a system that had done wrong for so long. It truly believed its sins would stay hidden. "Would you testify if it comes to that?" he asked. Eyes steady on hers. Marisol swallowed, then nodded. "I didn't come here to drop a USB and run. I want them held accountable. Not just for my grandmother, not just for my mother. For everyone too afraid to speak." Elijah stood, pulling his coat snug. "Then get ready. Once we leave this cafe, you won't just be an anonymous receptionist anymore. You'll be the person who forces an entire bank to face itself." He picked up the USB, his eyes turning cold, no longer the calm doctor, nor the shrewd investor. This wasn't personal anymore. This was war. A campaign to rip the mask off a system that thought itself untouchable. And Summit Financial was about to learn exactly what it felt like to be exposed from the inside out. The 45th floor boardroom of Summit's headquarters wasn't like any place where Elijah had ever been dismissed. Polished, walnut-paneled walls. An abstract painting worth the price of a house. A long, gleaming table reflecting soft golden light. Every detail in the room was designed to remind anyone who entered Power Lives here, and it is no illusion. 12 board members were already seated, lined up on either side of the table, their tailored suits forming a row of polished armor. At the head sat Richard Langford, Summit's CEO, the man once hailed on a finance magazine cover as the guardian of the last independent bank. He cleared his throat. We're waiting for the investor." He hadn't finished the sentence when the doors swung open. Footsteps echoed light but measured. Elijah Carter walked in. Not hurried, not bowing. His midnight blue suit was razor sharp, his cufflinks glinting under the soft light. Everything about him said one thing: this was not the same man Gregory Hales had humiliated in a bank lobby. This was an owner. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Board members who had once ignored his emails now turned, faces mixing shock with caution. Langford stood, extending a hand, but Elijah didn't immediately take it. Instead, he walked to the empty seat across from the CEO and sat, moving with a deliberate calm that bordered on defiance. "You are," a board member blurted, then bit his tongue, realizing how absurd the question sounded. Elijah spared him no suspense. Elijah Carter, owner of 24% of Summit Financial. The air thickened. Some tried to keep their faces neutral, but their clenched fingers on the armrests betrayed them. Langford forced a smile, the kind worn by a man who knows he's just lost control. "Dr. Carter, what a surprise. We were supposed to meet last week." Elijah tilted his head, his voice soft but weighted. "Yes, but I recall someone at this very branch told me to wait until they had time. I suppose today we found that time." A sharp throat clearing echoed from the far end of the table, but no one spoke up. Elijah reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick file, and slid it across to Langford. "We'll discuss what I need Summit to do. But first, let's talk about the culture you're protecting." Silent glances were exchanged. Some looked as if they were already calculating escape routes. Elijah sat upright, eyes sweeping over each face. He wasn't the man shamed in a bank lobby anymore. He was here to change the rules of the game, and the game had only just begun. At the far end of the table, Gregory Hales. Frozen. His pale face and trembling hands clutched the edge of his chair like someone holding on to power as it slipped away. No one said it out loud. But everyone in the room knew, if not for Carter, Summit would already be prey for the corporate predators circling outside. Langford, a man used to controlling every meeting, scrambled to regain footing. "Dr. Carter," he said, lowering his tone as if speaking privately, "we can discuss this discreetly. A mutually beneficial arrangement. No need to complicate." "No!" Elijah cut him off. Not loud, but clear enough for all 12 to hear. He leaned forward slightly, like a professor preparing to teach an expensive lesson. Public humiliation requires public reform. You've built a culture of discrimination. I won't let it continue in the shadows. He opened his briefcase again and dropped another file on the table. The thud made several flinch. "This," he said, "is a report of what's happening inside your branches. Data from over 30 independent audits, 7 buried discrimination complaints, disparities in customer service by skin color, manipulated promotion tracks." One board member flipped a few pages, then froze when they hit the detailed notes on HR practices at the branch Hales managed. A wave of unease swept across the table. "You can deny it all you want," Elijah said, voice steady as if reciting a fact, but numbers don't lie. "And now, we get to what I want." He slid another document toward Langford, 1 independent, system-wide audits. 2, a community oversight council with real authority. 3, mandatory anti-bias training for all employees and senior management. And I don't mean a box-checking course, I mean training with measurable results. Langford opened his mouth to push back, but Elijah spoke first. "I own enough shares to call for a vote on these measures. And if you refuse, I also hold enough evidence to make this a public scandal, one that Summit's brand wouldn't survive for a single day." Silence. Not agreement. The kind of silence that only comes when everyone realizes the board has just been cornered. Elijah leaned back, his gaze sweeping across the room. He wasn't just proposing reforms. He was forcing them to choose save their reputation or risk a fight they couldn't win. Langford blinked, as if struggling to process what had just been laid before him. His hand rested on the report but didn't turn a single page. Across the table, a previously silent board member finally spoke. "If we agree, what do you intend to do with Summit?" Elijah swiveled slightly, his gaze shifting to the window framing the city skyline. "First," he said, "I'll keep it alive. The conglomerates circling you don't want to build. They want to strip you for parts and leave the rest to rot. I want Summit to become something it's never dared to be, a bank that belongs to all its customers." At the far end, Gregory Hales squirmed, his lips moving without sound. Elijah turned back, his eyes locking on him. "Mr. Hales," he said slowly, "I'm sure you understand better than anyone what's in this report." Hales lowered his gaze. Langford reclined slightly, his voice dropping to a defeated murmur. "Dr. Carter, these demands won't be easy to accept. The board will worry they could hurt shareholder value." Elijah leaned in, voice low but sharp enough to cut, "I am a shareholder. A major one. And I just gave you a choice: save yourselves, or wait until the public does it for me." A low buzz of whispers passed between board members, weighing costs against survival. Elijah said nothing more. He let the silence do its work. In this room, silence had never been so terrifying. Finally, Langford exhaled like a man who had just let go of something he'd clung to for too long. "If we agree, what do you want in return?" Elijah shrugged, his face calm, the kind of calm that infuriates men used to holding power. "Just one thing: real change. Not for press releases, not to polish your ESG reports. Change that actually matters." He stood, gathering his documents and placing them neatly back into his briefcase. Then he looked directly at Langford. "I could destroy this bank, but I'm choosing to save it on my terms." A few faces were stunned. Others twisted, as if swallowing a bitter pill. Elijah didn't wait for their responses. He walked out, leaving behind a boardroom still struggling to breathe. And none of them yet understood. The real game had only just begun. The next day, the press room at Summit Financial's headquarters was immaculate, scrubbed to perfection. A hastily printed backdrop read, "Toward a fair and transparent Summit." It covered the glass wall that usually flaunted the bank's wealth. Dozens of cameras pointed toward the podium, where CEO Richard Langford stood beside Elijah Carter. Elijah's midnight blue suit was tailored to precision, his light gray tie offering a deliberate contrast. He didn't smile. His face wasn't here for PR. It was here for truth. Langford spoke first, like any CEO would, today. Summit Financial announces a series of critical reforms to reaffirm our commitment to fairness and transparency. His voice strained under the weight of the words. The room heard it. Then Elijah stepped to the microphone. He paused long enough for silence to force every eye and ear onto him. "Summit once told me I didn't belong here," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the room. "Now I own it." A wave of murmurs rolled through the press corps. Fingers flew across keyboards, cameras exploded with flashes. Elijah didn't lower his tone. "I'm not here merely as an investor. I'm here as someone who has seen and endured the truth about how this system treats people who don't fit its preferred mold." He opened a folder on the podium, flipping a few pages for emphasis. "We conducted independent audits across Summit's branches. The findings are undeniable. Customers of color waited longer. They were asked for more documents. They were denied opportunities freely given to others. This wasn't a series of isolated incidents. This was a system." A reporter shouted over the noise, Mr. Carter, are you saying Summit has an institutional policy of discrimination? Elijah stared straight into the cameras. I'm not suggesting it. I'm confirming it. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Langford stood stiff beside him, his clenched hands betraying his unease. Elijah closed the folder, his voice dropping lower but gaining weight. These reforms are not apologies. They are commitments. Summit will no longer be a place where someone decides who deserves first-class treatment and who gets treated like an outsider. He stepped back, scanning the crowd of reporters. This wasn't just a press conference to announce reforms. It was a warning to every other bank running the same game. Langford returned to the podium, and this time there was no swagger of a CEO steering his own narrative. He lowered his head, his words heavy. Summit Financial accepts all reforms proposed by Dr. Carter. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward, flashes blinding, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. A centuries-old bank, infamous for its conservatism, had just publicly surrendered to the demands of a new shareholder. Veteran financial journalists exchanged glances. They knew this moment would be remembered in banking history. Langford took a breath. We also announced that Gregory Hales, manager of our central branch, is immediately suspended pending a full investigation. The sentence fell like a lightning strike. Cameras went wild. A reporter yelled, "Are you making a scapegoat out of a senior manager?" Langford didn't answer. He stepped back, ceding the stage to Elijah. Elijah returned to the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the press row. This is not scapegoating. This is accountability. When a system breeds injustice, those who maintain it face consequences. A young journalist called out Dr. Carter. Do you really believe removing one individual can change an entire system? Elijah raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth curving into something almost sardonic. If removing one person could change the system, it wouldn't be much of a system, would it? The room fell silent for a beat. He continued, "That's why this doesn't stop with one individual. Summit will undergo independent audits. It will have a community oversight council, and it will require anti-bias training for all employees. These aren't options. They are conditions for this bank's survival." From the back, a financial reporter whispered to a colleague, "A single shareholder just did what the regulators couldn't." Elijah heard it. He didn't deny it. He turned to face the live television cameras broadcasting to millions. "Summit once told me I didn't belong here. Now the world knows who decides who belongs." Behind the flashing cameras, other bank executives watching from their offices understood. If Carter could do this to Summit, he could do it to them next. Elijah didn't step away immediately after Langford retreated. He stood there, letting the silence stretch, forcing everyone to sit with the weight of the moment. Finally, he spoke again. "Some have asked me why I didn't stay silent. Why I didn't simply enjoy the profits and keep things quiet." He let the question linger, echoing across the room. But silence keeps wounds open. It doesn't heal them. And if this system could humiliate me, a man with money and status, how do you think it treats those without? Another reporter pushed forward Mr. Carter. "Are you turning Summit into a personal instrument of power?" Elijah tilted his head, his eyes glinting with the faintest trace of amusement. "If your definition of a personal instrument is a bank forced to serve all customers fairly, then yes, I'll own that. I'll own so." A ripple of soft laughter rose from the younger reporters. But Elijah immediately tightened the tone. "This isn't about me. It's about everyone who has been told they deserve only patience and pity, not respect. That ends here, starting with Summit." He gestured for assistants to unveil large boards listing the reforms. Independent audits. A community oversight council. Measured anti-bias training. These aren't slogans. They are verifiable commitments. and I will not allow them to be watered down into PR campaigns. He stepped back to the microphone. Real power doesn't need to shout. It simply shows up and changes everything. No typing, no whispers. Even the most seasoned journalists just sat there silent witnesses to a moment they knew they'd be writing about for years. Elijah Carter hadn't just taken control of Summit. He had taken control of the narrative, leaving the rest of the banking world wondering. If he shows up at their doors tomorrow, what will they do? In just one night, Summit Financial's name appeared across every major headline. Not for profits, not for a merger, but for something that rarely makes the front page of financial news: real reform. This bank just admitted to systemic discrimination and committed to comprehensive change. One financial editor said on morning television, "This isn't just news, this is a precedent." Within days, other banks scrambled. Emergency meetings were called at midnight. CEOs suddenly cared about reports they'd ignored for years. One major corporation circulated an internal memo. "We are conducting a comprehensive review of our customer service policies." Behind the polished language, panic. No one wanted to become the next Summit forced to stand at a press conference, bow before the public, and be exposed by a shareholder. At Summit, the tide was turning this time in their favor. In the first month after the press conference, new account openings surged. Not from wealthy corporate clients, but from those once deemed not worth serving. Small shop owners, immigrant workers, families who had given up after years of loan denials. One economic journalist called it the Carter effect. When a bank is forced to face its wrongdoing and commit to reform, the forgotten communities return not as beggars, but with the expectation of fair treatment. At a branch in the South Side, a single mother walked out of a loan office with tears in her eyes. "They listened to me," she told a reporter. "For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't treated like I was begging." On the 45th floor, Langford reported to the board. Revenue is up 18% this quarter, largely driven by new customers from previously untapped markets. He spoke as if it had been his strategic vision all along. But everyone knew without Carter, Summit wouldn't even exist to enjoy this growth. Elijah quietly reviewed the report from his office. He wasn't surprised. He knew when a bank stops treating people like numbers, profits find their way in. But for him, this was only the first ripple. The Carter effect wasn't stopping at Summit. Other banks were watching and realizing. Change voluntarily, or wait for Elijah Carter to knock on their door. Gregory Hales sat in a modest classroom at a West Chicago community center, where warm, yellow light slipped through old window frames. On the board, understanding and dismantling unconscious bias. A course he'd never imagined himself attending. Months ago, Hales was in a polished wood-paneled office, barking orders, proud of his standards. Now, he held a dull pencil, scribbling notes like a student sent back to square one. "Did you ever think you weren't biased?" the instructor asked. Hales let out a faint laugh, unheard by anyone else. "I used to," he muttered under his breath. In a group exercise, an older woman once denied a loan at his branch shared her story. Hales lowered his head. Her words stung worse than any disciplinary meeting ever could. That afternoon, he volunteered at a nonprofit helping families excluded from the financial system. His first assignment, guiding a young couple through a small business loan application. The wife hesitated when she saw his buttoned-up shirt that still carried traces of a banker's posture. "You used to work for Summit?" she asked, suspicion lacing her voice. Haley's nodded. "Used to. Now I'm learning how to be human again." The room went silent. Perhaps even he hadn't expected to say it aloud. That evening, Hales walked back to the small apartment he was renting after losing his job. On the way, he recalled the day Elijah Carter walked into the boardroom with 24% ownership in his hand. He remembered the sinking realization that the man he once dismissed was now deciding his fate. That feeling had become his fuel to strip away his pride and face himself. But Hales wasn't the only one changing. News of his suspension and his mandatory bias training rippled through the industry like a warning shot. Other bank managers, once confident it could never happen to them, quietly signed up for similar courses. No one wanted to be the next Gregory Hales. Gregory Hales had once been the face of a closed system. Now, belatedly, he was becoming living proof that personal change is the first step toward repairing a broken institution. And somewhere high above, Elijah Carter knew that every person who had once dismissed him was now asking themselves, "Will I be the next Hales? Or will I change before it's too late?" In his high-rise office, afternoon light poured through the massive windows, spilling across Elijah Carter's desk. Before him lay Summit Financial's latest growth report. The numbers didn't lie. Quarterly revenue up 18%. Account openings in low-income neighborhoods doubled. Small business loan applications, mostly from once-ignored communities, at record highs. He flipped through the pages, pausing at the customer survey section. Handwritten comments made him squint not because they were hard to read, but because they hit deeper than any financial success. For the first time, I was treated like a real customer. They called me by my name, not my account number. Simple words, but heavier than any charter graph could ever convey. Yvonne Price entered, carrying another stack of files. "The Carter effect," she said, placing them on his desk. "That's what the financial press is calling this." Elijah smirked faintly. "I don't need a name for it, I need results." Yvonne took a seat across from him. "You've got results. Summit is drawing customers from neighborhoods other banks ignored for decades. And they're not just bringing revenue, they're bringing trust." Elijah leaned back, fingers steepled. "Sad, isn't it? It took a public scandal for Summit to learn a lesson they should have known all along. Treat people like people and they'll become your most loyal customers." He rose and walked to the window, gazing down at the bustling streets of Chicago. The city was still noisy, still restless. But now, within that chaos, he sensed something had shifted not in the city, but in himself. He was rewriting his role in the game. Justice and profit, he murmured to himself. Turns out they can coexist. Yvonne gathered her papers. "So what's next?" Elijah turned, his gaze sharper than ever. "Next, we make sure this isn't just a Summit phenomenon. If it can happen here, it can happen across the entire industry." He looked back at the report one last time. The numbers proved that change wasn't just necessary, it was profitable. And Elijah Carter knew he was far from finished. If justice could drive profit at Summit, he would force every other bank to learn the same lesson by any means necessary. A year can change everything. For Summit Financial, it changed the entire face of a bank once seen as the very emblem of conservatism. That morning, Elijah stood in front of the central branch, the very place where, a year ago, he had been humiliated by Gregory Hales's gaze and words that seemed harmless but cut deep. Now, the wide glass doors swung open to welcome him. No silent guards tracking his every step. No suspicious glances from behind the counters. Marisol Vega came out to greet him, wearing a simple yet professional suit. She smiled, a relaxed, confident smile that no longer resembled the nervous receptionist who once handed him a USB with trembling hands. "Welcome back, Dr. Carter," she said, her voice carrying the assurance of someone who knows exactly where she stands. Elijah looked closer. The space had changed. The towering counters and glass partitions that once created an invisible barrier between customers and staff were gone. In their place were open consultation tables where clients sat across from employees as equals. On the walls hung photos of community events, small business support programs, financial literacy workshops for workers, scholarship ceremonies for Black and minority students. "What do you think?" Marisol asked as they walked through the customer area. Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning every detail. Very different from the last time I stood here, and not just in the design. Marisol chuckled softly. We didn't just rearrange furniture, we changed how we think. Every new employee undergoes at least 30 hours of bias awareness training. And we track service outcomes across different demographics. Not for reports, for accountability, to make sure we don't go back. Elijah paused at the Community Financial Support Desk, where staff were helping customers fill out loan applications. He remembered this very room a year ago as the stage for a very public humiliation. You know, he said slowly, I once thought I'd never walk back into this place, but today, I'm glad I was wrong. Marisol's gaze held both pride and gratitude. You gave us the chance to do the right thing. This time, we didn't waste it. Elijah smiled. This wasn't just a successful reform. It was proof that real victories, the quiet ones, deep within the system, are what force entire structures to bow. In a small conference room at the end of the hallway, a group of young entrepreneurs awaited Elijah. Their hands clutched thick folders, but their eyes said more than any paperwork hunger and a touch of fear. Feelings Elijah knew all too well. Thank you for meeting with us, a young woman spoke up. Her blazer was fraying at the edges, but her eyes burned bright. We've applied for loans at 3 banks. 2 didn't bother to respond. The other demanded collateral we don't have. Elijah sat, nodding gently. And Summit. It's different this time, a young man replied, still sounding surprised. They called us. They listened. Not to find reasons to reject us, but to find a way to help. Marisol added with a faint smile. We call it the Fair Lending Program, but really, it's just treating people like people. Elijah looked at their young faces, people daring to dream, but once crushed by a system designed to keep those dreams out. He saw himself 30 years ago, a young man walking into a bank with a business plan and belief, only to leave with a slammed door behind him. I know what it feels like, Elijah said softly, to be rejected not because your idea is bad, but because they can't imagine you succeeding. I've heard those words myself, and today I'm here to make sure you don't hear them again. The young woman clutched her folder tighter, eyes glistening. You don't know what this means to us. Elijah leaned forward, a slight smile on his lips. I do, because I used to be you. He pulled out his phone, dialing. I'll connect your group with the director of the Fair Lending Program. We'll work together. This time, the door won't close. In that moment, the room fell silent, as if they were all holding back tears. Elijah rose, shaking each of their hands not with pity, but like colleagues greeting each other before a new project. As he walked out, he didn't just see young entrepreneurs. He saw his younger self finally walking through an open door. And he knew the real impact of these reforms wasn't in growth reports. It was in dreams brought back to life. That afternoon, Elijah sat alone in the top-floor boardroom, the late sunlight slanting through massive glass panes, bathing the room in gold. His day had been filled with meetings and reports, but his mind kept returning to those young faces, the way their eyes lit up when they were heard, when they realized that a door once locked was now open. A soft knock at the door. Marisol entered with a folder. Here's the monthly report for the Fair Lending Program, she said, placing it on the table. We've approved over 200 applications from small businesses and households, most of them people who had been denied multiple times before. Elijah flipped through the pages. The numbers didn't just speak of money. They told stories, small shops expanding, families buying their first homes, students continuing their studies thanks to approved loans. He nodded gently, then looked up at Marisol. You've done well. She smiled but hesitated. Dr. Carter, she asked quietly, is this a victory? After everything you've done, after what we've been through, is this what you wanted? Elijah leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. He remembered the early days walking into Summit as a nameless customer, humiliated in front of strangers. He remembered wanting to strike back immediately, to prove his worth with a devastating blow. But now, standing in a bank transformed from the inside out, he realized he hadn't come here for revenge. He met Marisol's gaze, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Victory," he said, "isn't making someone kneel. It's making an entire system stand the right way." Marisol nodded, as if finally understanding what Elijah had been after all along. This wasn't retaliation. It was rehabilitation, giving those once excluded a place to belong, and forcing those who caused the exclusion to learn a new way forward. Elijah stood, walking to the massive window, gazing out at a city glowing under the streetlights. He knew this journey wasn't over. There were more systems, more summits still out there, waiting to be transformed. And he wouldn't stop until they stood up too. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.